In this lecture we'll do the first part of a base humanoid rig, and we'll only do one side because we'll symmetrize it later on. For this exercise we'll be using this base character here, which you can download with this lecture. So let's start rigging our character by adding an armature. So Shift A to add, down to armature, and again yours will just pop up with a single bone if you've not got any add-ons. Now the bone's see-through, that suggests we're in X-ray mode, so I'll jump to solid mode and turn off X-ray mode, and we'll change the bone properties in the object data properties under viewport display in front. Also we'll turn on the axes so we can easily see the axis of the bone, so we can talk through those aspects. So I'll jump into edit mode, into front view, select my bone, I'll scale it down slightly, and G to grab in the Z axis so it still stays in the center, and move it to around there so it's kind of in line with the very top of the thigh just there. Now keeping it in the Z axis is important. We're going to model one side and then mirror it across to the other side. So having an inline down the middle is important. I'll zoom in a touch. I'll bring this down a little bit, so G then Z, and I'll bring it down to this top fold of the jumper just there, or the sweater if you're American. E to extrude in the Z, bring that up so it's about the same size bone. E to extrude in the Z, and this is just under the armpits, E to extrude in the Z, and just under the chin. So they should be similar sized bones, so I'll just reposition those very slightly. It won't make a great deal of difference if they're slightly different sizes. I could have started with one bone and subdivided it 4 times and they'd be exactly the same length, but again, the size isn't too important. I'll go to side view and line them up here. So we want a slight curve to the back. So I'll select the top one, again G then Y, and these two, G then Y, and G then Y, just so there's a nice simple curve like this. Then it's a good idea to label my bones, so I'll go through each one, F2, and this will be called spine 1, then spine 2, spine 3, and spine 4. From here we have the neck bone, so E to extrude up, and E to extrude up for the head, and I'll rename these, neck and head. Okay, so we've got the basic shape there. It's worth at this point noticing the direction of the bone roll as it's known. The Y direction always goes down the length of the bone from head to tail, but the X and the Z direction could easily be adjustable. Generally speaking, you keep the local X axis of the bone to the X axis. Then if I want to, let's say, nod the head, I would select this top bone, for example. This is in pose mode, of course, and press X twice for the local X axis, and I know that's the correct axis. We use the local axis, of course, because if the character twists around, it's still the correct direction. Okay, so you may want to pause the video here and catch up with me, placing in the bones of the spine. I'll just go to side view so you can see it easily, and pause the video and catch up with me. Okay, so back to front view. We want an arm bone coming down here. I can copy one of the main bones of the spine, that would work fine, but if I move my 3D cursor, so Shift right click, and press Shift A to add, a bone will be added. Then I can start moving this into position. And once again, the X axis, where the bones will kind of fold, so the bone out here, we want the X axis pointing up and down. I'll extrude one out here first, and go to top view in just a moment to position them correctly. I'll press E to extrude and bring a bone out for the hand, and then E to extrude one for the fingers just there. I'm keeping it simple for the moment, so we'll just have one bone that controls all the fingers for now. Let's then go to top view. I'll select all the bones and bring them back slightly, so G then Y, and position them in top view. I'll do one more bone out here for the thumb, just in case we want to spread that out slightly. So this time I'll select this bone, Shift D to duplicate, and move it outwards. Now the important thing to understand is when you duplicate a bone like this, instead of just adding it like we did for the shoulder, is that it duplicates the attributes as well as the bone, and therefore it's parented to this bone here, which is actually helpful in our case. So I'll try and position this so it's in line with the thumb, and then go to front view, G to grab, and we're roughly in line. There's one snapping method that's really useful here. So if I go up to snapping and into the snapping settings, there's snap to volume, and you can leave everything at default. But what that will try and do is find the middle of the mesh. So if I press G to grab now and move this, you can see it's trying to snap to the end there. And it should, if I focus on that with period key, it should be right in the middle of that thumb. So snap to volume can be very useful for positioning your bones. I'll do the same with this one. So G to grab and move it into the middle there. And again, period key to zoom in on that so I can see the position and it's right in the center. Okay, so once again, the x-axis is up and down in this case, so it will fold kind of inwards at the elbow, and it's true for the wrist as well and the fingers as well. You don't tend to change the bone roll for a chain of bones. Okay, so now's a good time to catch up with me and position the bones for your arm. Okay, let's come down to the legs then. Also just be aware that I've still got my snapping to volume turned on, so I'll leave that on for now. I'll move the 3D cursor to this position just here. So that's where the leg folds. So it's a good position for the start of the bone because we'll have a transition of the weights across here. So Shift A to add, and let's move this into position. Now when moving that into position, you can see the bone has an unusual roll now, and it's not really helping us if we want to use the local axis for bending the leg, as it's going to go off at a slight angle. So we want to adapt the bone roll in this case. If I press N on my keyboard and go up to Item, you have a roll option just here, and we can therefore roll that around so that the x-axis is pointed in the right direction. Let's just go to front view and make sure that's lined up nicely, so around about there. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. This positioning will work just fine. Notice also that the z-axis is the opposite way from these ones. That's because it's in the opposite direction. So I'll go back to front view and extrude out, so E to extrude, and bring that down to the ankle just there. And let's go across to side view and line these up. So I need this to come back, so G then Y. Remember, for the sake of IK, we want a slight bend in the leg in the direction that it will bend. So G then Y to move that forward slightly. And let's just make sure that's in the right place. That looks good. And E to extrude out for the foot and the toes. So we've got a very basic humanoid setup. I do need to go through and label the bones that I've added. So upper arm. And this time I'll put in .L, so Blender knows it's the left arm, because we'll symmetrize later on, and having the correct naming conventions, Blender will automatically change the names to .R for the right. And I'll go through each of these, but do remember to put the .L suffix. Then I'll come down to the leg, upper leg.L, shin.L, foot.L, and toes.L. And one thing I'm noticing, I just want to double check the roll on this. It looks a tiny bit out. It's very minor, but we might want to go across to the x-axis. So the x-axis is nicely in line there. It's fairly minor, but for the feet, it's really helpful to have them flat on the ground when we're moving them. So now's a good time to catch up with me and add in the leg bones and make sure your bones are all labeled correctly. Okay, so we're almost there, but there's a couple more bones that we need. First of all, we need a way for the arm to connect to the spine, and we have a clavicle bone going across here, so we can kind of shrug the shoulders. So I'll Shift right click, Shift A to add, and reposition this as a clavicle. Do remember, if like me, you've got snapping to volume still turned on, that will affect its movement. I'll come around to the side here, G then Y, to move that forward a little bit. The position of these bones is often quite rough, and somewhere around here is acceptable. You might want to change the bone roll a little bit here. I'll adjust the bone roll so the X is pointing out towards the front. It doesn't make much of a difference whether it's the X or the Z, as long as one of them is pointing out to the front. Then we can use that axis to rotate around. And I'll just adjust it slightly more so it's definitely facing the front there. So we want to parent the arm bone to the clavicle. So when we rotate the clavicle, we can shrug the shoulders. And the clavicle, which I'll call the shoulder for ease, needs to move with the spine. I'll rename it first, so shoulder.L, and select my upper arm and shoulder second, Control P, and keep offset, because we don't want the head of the upper arm to move to the shoulder bone. And the same for the shoulder bone to the spine. Now this is a tiny bit tricky. If I go to front view, you might be tempted to parent it to this bone here, so the relationship comes down here. But it's important to think about how the arm will move with the spine. And it's actually this bone here, so when this bone bends, the shoulder bends with it. You could have a situation where the neck is kind of bending independently of the shoulder. So we've got to make sure that it's attached here. So I'll select this bone just here, Control P to parent, keep offset. And you'll notice the relationship line goes to the end there. I'm just looking at it and it's a tiny bit low just here. So I'm going to press G then Z and move it up just slightly. Oh, I'll turn off snapping because this bone's a little bit more to the front of our volume. G then Z, move that up slightly. There we go. And let's come back out and think about how the thigh bone is going to attach. And again, we want a hip bone because you can swivel your hips. So I'll actually extrude out from this point here, so E to extrude, to somewhere around here, and I'll call that hip.L. Just double check that from side view, and that's fine. And the bone roll should be fine for this one. And we want to connect this one up to our hip bone. So if we move the hip bone, the upper thigh will move with it. So I'll select the hip bone last, Control P, and again keep offset. So I'll deselect all, and we've got the basis of our rig set up. So pause the video here and catch up with me, making sure you've got the base rig all in place. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time.